because I know that there are some countries within CARICOM who despise and would not want to get involved in this dependency syndrome approach. Yet there are others who see this as to be of some importance in helping to implement some of their development activities. And you actually find that this difference of approach does play out in some of the debate, the leadership, the discussions among the leaders at the heads of government and the councils of the region. So it is an issue, and I think it could only be changed when some of the leaders do recognize that the dependency syndrome approach is not necessarily the more desirable one, but rather in a very, very almost legitimate and rule of law way, you look at the issues, see what is important for your country, and move forward and implement that particular part of your policy.
Ambassador Menon?
Second question on structural. You answered it?
Yes, she's asking whether you. Yes. He says you can take that one.
Okay. I wasn't so sure. I wasn't sure what exactly your concern. What kind of structural groupings were you thinking of?
ACP.
No, I still don't get the point. Can you sort of elaborate a bit more, because I'm trying to figure out what the problem is.
She's saying what is the...
For example, so many seats are allotted to WEOG, et cetera, for non-perm seats in the Security Council.
Yes, yes.
How do those cross-regional groups, such as ACP, landlocked states, address some of those issues in terms of acquisition of leadership roles and power and influence?
I am not aware of the ACP or SIDS actually engaging in any discussion on that kind of allocation of seats in the UN bodies. If they do, it's only for maybe some specific conference that's coming up relating to the interests of LDCs or economic climate change conference. For example, recently I think all the small states got together and supported John Ash to chair one of the committees of the conference that's taking place right now in Bonn in the run-up to Copenhagen. So that kind of support, I think we can throw behind one of our small countries. But when it comes to the Security Council and many of the other political bodies, I don't see the SIDS grouping sitting down and discussing. It's difficult because most of those seats are allocated on a regional basis, not on the basis of small states or big states. So you will have to speak up within your own regional grouping to make sure that your voice is heard. And it so happens, often happens that the big boys will have a louder voice and they will insist on getting their way. Bring in their own candidate at the last minute, and because they are big and because they have the lobbying power, they're able to get their way. And I think Chris would know the case of 1988, I think, 87 or 88, I believe, when Dame Nita Barrow of Barbados ran for the presidency of the General Assembly, and just a few months, 4 or 5 months before the election, or a few months before the election, another country in Latin America threw its head into the ring. And because the country was much bigger, they were able to lobby much more effectively and get their way. So I think that's where I think the small states will need to look for ways in which they can help one another in terms of lobbying for a particular seat that you're going to run for. But to decide as a grouping that, look, you should run for this seat or that seat, I think it's not really going to work. And secondly, you have to ask yourself a bigger question. If you get into those bodies, are you able to perform? If you're not able to do a good job, then don't try getting into the bodies. That's my advice. If you want to serve as a non-permanent member for 2 years, make sure you have sufficient resources, make sure you have sufficient knowledge to serve effectively in the council. If you don't have the resources, you don't have the manpower, and you don't have the knowledge, then I think you should focus your attention elsewhere in the UN, which is of greater interest to you than to run for the Security Council seat. Or even for the matter, running for some of these bodies of the UN, chairing this committee or that committee. I sometimes ask myself, how important is it for a country? Frankly, it's not very important. I mean, you're stuck for 3 months chairing a committee of the UN from September until December. Effectively, you take one person away from the work of the mission to sit up there in the podium for 3 months. The mission, which is only has 2 people, is now reduced to 1. And you expect the one person to cover the remaining 8 committees. And probably the one person has to help the person who's chairing the committee by being the backup. So effectively, you have nobody to cover the rest of the UN. So you have to think twice. Do you really want to run for these bodies? I mean, if you can't, then how, if you really want to run, how do you make sure you run for it and make sure you do an effective, play an effective role in the committee that you get into? It's a chicken and egg problem. You need to get into the committees to profile yourself. You need to get into the committees to show that you are effective. And yet, once you get in there, you find sometimes you just can't, you just don't have the resources or the clout to play that role. So you've got to think through these issues and plan long term. In other words, if you're going to run for a seat, don't do it for something tomorrow. Plan for something 1 or 2 years down the road. So you have time to build up the resources and the knowledge before you run for the seat.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up now, but I'm going to give each of the ambassadors 1 minute to say something to close. And I'd like you to respond in that closing to well, how do you see the future of small island states, particularly with a number of, particularly in light of the redistribution of power. You have new rising states, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, all coming on the scene now. How's that going to affect the future of small island states? Would you like to go first? Or?
Yes, I will, and I understand you're giving me a quick minute. I think what we need to strive for is to have a greater role in the governance arrangements of some of the institutions of the UN. And at the risk of simplifying things, that is the one point I would certainly emphasize, because it is true that means that you already have a greater ability to participate in the decision-making and the norm-setting of some of these institutions. And the one example I would cite really would be in the financial area, where we have been pressing, and this is now going to be an issue on the agenda of the upcoming conference in June on the response to the financial crisis. We've been pressing, for some change in the financial architecture of the Bretton Woods institutions. So the governance arrangements need to change, greater involvement on the part of developing countries, and hopefully some from the Caribbean as well, so that we can have a greater voice.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hackett. Ambassador Menon.
Some of these new emerging powers are the powers that are looking to play a bigger role in the UN and the international stage. And at the UN in particular, that means running for a permanent seat in the Security Council, getting a permanent seat in the Security Council. And this is where I think the small states, like I said earlier, have a lot of clout. Each of them as a vote. You may be a country located thousands of miles all by yourself in the Pacific, but you're still a member of the United Nations and you're one vote. Do not give away your vote so easily. If you're going to give your vote to someone, make sure you get something in return. You have to be realistic about all these things. I'm not expecting you to ask for cash, but look for something that will help the country. Not individually. I'm not talking about corruption. I'm talking about how you can help your country. Make sure that your vote pays off for your country. And that is important. Because ultimately, for example, Security Council reform, you need to get a vote. You need 128 votes to be elected in the General Assembly as a permanent member. That's only the first step. A lot more things to be done after that. So if you're going to if you're going to support a country, you make sure you get something in return. And too often small states, I think, give away their vote without expecting too much. The promises made to you, we will deliver, don't worry, we'll do some training here, training there. I say expect it in writing, and I want it up front. You don't give it to me, I give you nothing in return. So you have to be quite bloody-minded about these things. This is the United Nations after all. A lot of hypocrisy, a lot of nonsense, a lot of games being played. And if you don't play the game, you lose out. So make sure you learn the tricks of the trade and be as tough with the big boys as they can be tough on you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Menon. And thank you all for being with us.
I just want to thank, on behalf of all of us, our panelists. I think at a conference on small, middle, and emerging powers at the UN, we couldn't hope for more insightful views than we received from these three folks who are in the trenches as representatives of small, middle, and emerging powers at the UN. So thank you so much for very insightful presentations. I'll now invite you to move to the breakout panels. And locations of some have changed, so I encourage you to check the poster board at the entrance to the LRC. For example, the HIV/AIDS one will be in this room. So thanks so much.